It is just after 7 o'clock on the morning of December 7, 1941. Two young Army privates are sitting inside a mobile radar truck on the north shore of Oahu, Hawaii. Their names are Joseph Lockard and George Elliott. Their radar is an Army set called the SCR-270. It is one of the newest pieces of technology in the American military. The two men have been on duty since 4 in the morning, and their shift ended at 7. But their ride to breakfast is late. So Elliot, still learning the equipment, asks Lockard if they can keep practicing. At 2 minutes past 7, something appears on the screen. It is the largest signal Lockard has ever seen. Not a handful of aircraft, not a small formation. This is a massive cluster coming from the north, about 130 miles out and closing fast. Elliot calls the information center at Fort Shafter. An Army private named Joseph McDonald picks up. The plotters have left for breakfast, but Donald finds the only officer still in the building, an Air Corps lieutenant named Kermit Tyler. It is only Tyler's second shift in the information center, and he has received almost no training. McDonald relays the warning. A large number of planes are heading straight for Oahu. Tyler thinks about it for a moment. He knows a flight of American B-17 bombers is scheduled to arrive from the mainland that morning. He has heard that Hawaiian music on local radio can be used to guide incoming aircraft, and he heard it earlier. Tyler tells McDonald not to worry about it. McDonald calls back to the radar station and tells Lockard. Lockard is not satisfied. He insists on speaking directly to the lieutenant. Tyler gets on the line and repeats his answer. Do not worry about it. Less than an hour later, the first Japanese bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. This is not a story about a day with no warning signs. It is a story about warnings that came from multiple directions, through multiple channels, and were missed, delayed, or misunderstood before they could reach the people who needed them most. The Pearl Harbor intelligence failure was not only a failure of information, it was a failure of the system built to handle that information. Here's how it happened. To understand why the warnings before Pearl Harbor went unheard, we need to go back to the summer of 1940. In September 1940, after years of painstaking effort, a small team of American code breakers achieved something extraordinary. Led by a civilian cryptanalyst named William Friedman, the Army's Signal Intelligence Service cracked the Japanese diplomatic cipher known as Purple. Purple was the most sophisticated encryption system the Japanese government used to communicate with its embassies around the world. The intelligence that came from reading these messages was given the code name Magic. It was one of America's most closely guarded secrets. Magic gave American officials an extraordinary window into the thinking of the Japanese government. They could read messages between Tokyo and its diplomats in Washington, Berlin, and Rome. They could track the progress of negotiations. They could see in real time how Japanese leaders were preparing for what might come next. It was, by any measure, one of the greatest intelligence achievements of the 20th century, but the process of decoding purple messages was slow and difficult. The volume of intercepted traffic was enormous, and there were far too few translators who could read Japanese. Under an Army-Navy agreement, responsibility rotated by day. Finished translations could lag behind events by hours or even days. But here is the problem. Magic was so secret that almost nobody was allowed to see it. Only a handful of senior officials in Washington had access. The President, the Secretary of State, the Army Chief of Staff, General George Marshall, the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Harold Stark, a few others. The raw intercepts were hand-delivered in locked briefcases. Recipients were often required to read them in the presence of a courier and hand the documents back immediately. And here is the key detail. The two commanders who were responsible for defending Pearl Harbor, Admiral Husband Kimmel and Lieutenant General Walter Short, were not regular recipients of magic intercepts. They had no purple decryption machine in Hawaii. They depended on Washington to tell them what mattered. Washington did not share enough. The intelligence that existed before Pearl Harbor did not come from a single source. It came from several streams, each flowing through a different part of the American government, and no one was responsible for putting those streams together. The first stream was the magic diplomatic intercepts themselves. By the fall of 1941, the volume of Japanese diplomatic traffic had increased sharply. Messages between Tokyo and the Japanese embassy in Washington showed negotiations hardening. A November 5 intercept set a deadline of November 25th for talks with the United States to succeed. A later message set November 29 and warned that after that, things would happen automatically. The second stream came from human sources. As early as January 1941, the American ambassador in Tokyo, Joseph Grew, warned the State Department about a report that Japan might launch a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Navy intelligence looked into the tip and later treated it as unconfirmed. The warning was filed away. The third stream was one of the most telling. On September 24, 1941, Japanese naval intelligence sent a message to the Japanese consulate in Honolulu. It asked the consulate to divide Pearl Harbor into a grid of 5 sub-areas and to report the positions of American warships in each zone. This message was intercepted and decrypted. It later became known as the bomb plot message. The bomb plot message stood out because it went beyond routine shipping reports. It asked for a specific grid of Pearl Harbor and exact ship positions. To anyone focused on Hawaii, that level of detail should have raised alarms, but it was not sent as a warning to the commanders in Hawaii. Some later argued that Japan also sought ship reports on other ports, but the Pearl Harbor request used a detailed grid. Now recall the promise from the cold open. The warnings existed, but no single person or office was responsible for gathering them, comparing them, and deciding what they meant. One of the most damaging factors in the Pearl Harbor intelligence failure was something that had nothing to do with Japan. It was a power struggle inside the United States Navy. In 1941, Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, the head of the Navy's War Plans Division, argued that the Office of Naval Intelligence should focus on collecting information and passing it along. He believed the War Plans Division should decide what warnings to issue to fleet commanders. This approach narrowed the intelligence office's role. It also made it harder for analysts to send urgent warnings on their own. The consequences were real. Officers who wanted to send more urgent warnings to Pearl Harbor could be edited or overruled. Arthur McCollum in Naval Intelligence drafted a stronger warning message in early December. It was edited and not sent. Lawrence Safford, a senior figure in Navy code-breaking, also pressed for a stronger warning. On the Army side, a similar pattern played out. Rufus Bratton, the Army's lead intelligence officer for the Far East, grew increasingly alarmed as the intercepts piled up in late November and early December. He tried to get General Marshall's attention. He was told to go through channels. The system that was supposed to process intelligence had become a system that slowed it down. Meanwhile, the two men who would later bear much of the blame, Admiral Kimmel and General Short in Hawaii, were operating on incomplete information. They received a war warning message from Washington on November 27, 1941. That message used the phrase, "This dispatch is to be considered a war warning," but it did not identify Hawaii as a likely target. Kimmel and Short took precautions, but they focused on sabotage, not an air raid. They were not shown the bomb plot message. They were not shown intercepts showing Japanese embassies being ordered to destroy their codes and cipher machines. They did not see the full picture. Now back to December 7, 1941. In Washington, the Army's Signal Intelligence Service had intercepted a long message from Tokyo to its embassy in Washington the evening before. The message came in 14 parts. The first 13 arrived on the night of December 6. They outlined Japan's complaints against the United States. President Roosevelt read them that evening. He was later reported to have said words to the effect that this meant war. But the 14th part did not arrive until early the next morning. It was the critical section. It declared that further negotiations were impossible. A separate short message instructed the Japanese ambassador to deliver the full reply to the American Secretary of State at precisely 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Washington time. 1 o'clock in Washington was 7:30 in the morning in Hawaii. A Navy officer named Lieutenant Commander Alwyn Kramer immediately recognized what the 1 o'clock delivery time meant. He pointed out that it corresponded to early morning in Hawaii and just before dawn in several other potential targets. The timing suggested an attack was imminent. General Marshall arrived at his office close to noon, Washington time. After reading the intercepts, he decided to send a warning to all Pacific commands, including Hawaii. He chose to send a written warning through official channels. Marshall wrote out a warning message by hand. It was sent to the Army Signal Center for transmission. But technical problems disrupted the Army's direct radio link to Hawaii that morning. Rather than use the Navy's communications system, which was working, the signal center sent the message by commercial telegraph through Western Union. The telegram was received in Honolulu after the attack had already begun. A messenger was on his way to deliver it to General Short's headquarters as the attack began. The warning arrived at Short's office hours after the Japanese planes had come and gone. So let us hold this picture clearly. The American government had cracked the Japanese diplomatic code. It had intercepted a 14-part message that ended negotiations. It had seen a delivery instruction timed to early morning in Hawaii. The Army Chief of Staff wrote a warning, and that warning traveled from Washington to Honolulu by commercial telegram, arriving too late to be acted on in time. This was not a failure of intelligence. It was a failure of communication, coordination, and urgency at every level. The radar sighting and the 14-part message were not the only warnings missed that morning. Before dawn on December 7, the minesweeper Condor spotted what appeared to be a submarine periscope near the entrance to Pearl Harbor. The sighting was reported to the destroyer Ward, which began searching the area. At around 6:37 in the morning, the Ward spotted a small submarine following an American ship toward the harbor. The destroyer opened fire and then dropped depth charges. The submarine sank soon after. The Ward's captain, Lieutenant Commander William Outerbridge, immediately radioed headquarters. His message was clear. They had attacked and fired upon a submarine operating in a restricted area near Pearl Harbor. This was a clear hostile act. An unidentified submarine had been found trying to sneak into the most important American naval base in the Pacific. The Ward's report was clear and urgent, but the report moved slowly through the chain of command. Officers at the 14th Naval District Headquarters wanted confirmation before escalating. They discussed it among themselves. They hesitated. Admiral Kimmel was informed but decided to wait for verification. By the time anyone was prepared to take decisive action, the Japanese planes were already in the air over Oahu. Think about that. Within the span of a single morning, 3 separate warnings arrived. A submarine was sunk at the harbor entrance. A massive formation of aircraft appeared on radar, and a decoded diplomatic message pointed to a deadline at 7:30 Hawaii time. Each warning on its own might have been ambiguous. Together they told a clear story. But nobody put them together, because nobody's job was to put them together. This is what the historian Roberta Wohlstetter later described as the core problem. In her landmark 1962 study of the Pearl Harbor intelligence failure, Wohlstetter argued that American officials did not fail for want of relevant information. They failed because there was too much irrelevant information surrounding it. The signals were lost in the noise, not because the signals were weak, but because the system had no way to separate what mattered from what did not. In the days immediately following the attack, President Roosevelt appointed a commission led by Supreme Court Justice Owen Roberts to investigate what had happened. The Roberts Commission flew to Hawaii, interviewed witnesses, and issued its report in January 1942. The commission placed the blame squarely on Admiral Kimmel and General Short. The 2 commanders, the report concluded, have been guilty of errors of judgment and dereliction of duty. Within 10 days of the attack, both men had been relieved of command. Both were reduced from their wartime ranks. Both were essentially forced into early retirement. Neither man was ever court-martialed, but neither was ever given a fair opportunity to defend himself in a formal proceeding. The Roberts Commission did not allow them legal counsel or the right to cross-examine witnesses. Later investigations told a different story. A Navy Court of Inquiry in 1944 largely exonerated Kimmel, finding that his decisions were reasonable given the limited information available to him. The court criticized Admiral Stark in Washington for failing to provide adequate warning. An Army board reached similar conclusions about General Short, faulting General Marshall for not following up on the November 1941 war warning. But because those findings implicitly revealed that America had broken the Japanese codes, a vital wartime secret, the results were kept classified until after the war. In all, there would be multiple official investigations into the Pearl Harbor disaster. The conclusions shifted over time. Some blamed the commanders in Hawaii. Some blamed officials in Washington. The 1995 Dorn Report, commissioned by the Department of Defense, concluded that responsibility should not fall solely on Kimmel and Short, and that blame should be broadly shared. In 1999, the United States Senate passed a resolution calling for both men to be posthumously restored to their full wartime ranks, but no president has acted on that resolution. Some senior officers later argued that Kimmel and Short were blamed in part to protect public confidence in leaders in Washington. The system failed. Then it blamed the two men standing closest to the aftermath. Remember the two young privates at the radar station? Lockhart and Elliott did their job. They detected the incoming planes. They reported what they saw. The switchboard operator tried twice to get the duty officer to act. The system told them all to stand down. And remember the telegram? General Marshall's warning sent by commercial wire service was delivered after the attack had already begun. The Pearl Harbor intelligence failure was not caused by a lack of information. America had broken the Japanese diplomatic code. It had intercepted messages pointing to war. It had intelligence reports about the harbor. It had radar tracking inbound aircraft. It had a submarine sinking at the harbor gate. What America did not have was a system that could take all of those pieces, put them together, and deliver a clear warning to the people who needed it in time to act. The catastrophe of December 7, 1941 forced a reckoning that reshaped the American government. In the years that followed, the intelligence failures at Pearl Harbor became a driving force behind the National Security Act of 1947. That law created the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Council, and a unified Defense Department, later called the Department of Defense. For the first time, the United States had a central organization meant to coordinate intelligence and bring it to the people who made decisions. The act was designed, above all, to ensure that what happened on that Sunday morning in Hawaii could never happen again. The lesson of Pearl Harbor was not simply that America needed better spies or faster code machines. The lesson was that information, no matter how good, is worthless if the system carrying it is broken. It is a lesson that echoes far beyond 1941. On December 7, two young soldiers saw the largest radar signal of their lives. They called it in. They were told not to worry. 53 minutes later, the first wave struck. If this story made you think, or if you learned something new about the warnings before Pearl Harbor, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. We tell stories like this one every week. Stories of the decisions, the people, and the systems that shaped the world. Hit the subscribe button, and we will see you in the next one.